All right, so I think I see in the online room, I see people. I don't know if you also see me, I think so. So welcome, so it's the second lecture of the KASKlezing we do online. So it's a bit, it's still a bit strange, but also have the feeling we're getting better in it. So maybe after a whole semester of online lectures, we don't want to go back to offline and we want to stay behind our computer screen. Who knows? So tonight is the lecture of Amy Franceschini. This lecture is not only a KASKlezing, but it's also a lecture that takes place in the framework of Tot in de Stad. For the people who don't know Tot in de Stad, Tot in de Stad is a joint effort of organizations in Ghent who focus on artistic practices that take place outside the institutional walls. And then the physical institutional walls, but also the conceptual institutional walls, I would say. So Amy is an artist whose practice clearly fits this description, I think. Most important that she is a founding member of Futurefarmers. Founded in 1995, Futurefarmers brings together a diverse group of practitioners aligned through an interest in making work that is relevant to the time and place surrounding us. So Futurefarmers are artists, designers, architects, anthropologists, writers, and farmers with a common interest in creating framework for exchange that catalyze moments of not knowing. They work closely together with scientists, creating answers on questions raised by them, but most important, raised by nature. The answers they gave are presented at institutions as the Whitney Museum of American Art, the MoMA in New York, Guggenheim, Maxi in Rome, the Sharia Biennial, the Taipei Biennial, and many others. Besides Futurefarmers, Amy Franceschini has been the initiator of a number of different projects, like Free Soil and Free Kitchen, where she brought together elements related to gardening, public space, technology, and social change. So elements that are quite present in all her practice. In 2010, she was a Guggenheim Fellow, and in 2009, she received the Creative Capital Award in the discipline of emerging fields. So this is very brief who Amy is. Of course, she's here and she will talk about all her projects. So I think it doesn't make sense to continue explaining what she's doing. So Amy, she will give a talk, and after this talk, we can ask questions or we have a discussion. And if you have any questions during the lecture, there is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and there you can write down your questions. And then I ask them to Amy. So normally I would say, please put your hands together for Amy Franceschini. This is a bit difficult now. So I just give the words to Amy. And Amy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We hear you perfectly.
Yes. Fine. Hello, people out there somewhere. Godard, thank you for inviting me, and Simon for getting us online and hopefully smooth tonight, and Kask for being Kask. I'm sitting in the town of Ghent in Belgium, in Europe, in the Northern Hemisphere. And tonight I'm going to show a couple of projects that I chose that seem to represent the various ways that we work. So I'm going to just start by sharing my screen. See if we can do this. And can everyone see this, or can you see this, Godard?
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Perfect.
So I called this talk tonight Presence as Practice, and I think that'll show itself in the work. But I think the work that I chose to show is really about how much time they take and how much physical, social, emotional presence some of the work we do asks. So Futurefarmers is a group of various practitioners, and it was started in San Francisco. And this is an attempt to kind of map the people and places and projects over the last 24 years. And it's also a portrait of the residency program that we ran since 1995 that brought artists and designers together, predominantly in San Francisco, to do work together, always pushing each other to try to do something new or push ourselves beyond our comfort zones. And what this residency did is really start to build a network of people that we've worked with over the years in different places. So just a close-up. This is sort of a performative aspect of ourselves. We often are feeling kind of caught between the dualism of the domestic and the controlled and the wild and the weedy and the standardized, the industrialized versus the maybe ancient forms. So these donkeys sort of represent our stubbornness to stay in between these places and see what happens. This is actually an image from an exhibition we had recently where we had 2 donkeys in the museum going through our archives and our video archives and writing down what they heard and saw in our 12 years of working. We also, I would say, a kind of working methodology that I talk about is called situational intelligence. So this is an image I found in Rudolf Steiner's library in upstate New York in a book on alternative education. And I saw the image and I thought that's a beautiful image. And it's a portrait of this idea of situational intelligence where you kind of don't have all the tools you might need to realize something, so you use what you have at hand. And often children are the best practitioners in fantasizing and being able to kind of do things without the practical means that we kind of lock ourselves into. So often as a starting point in projects, we try to enter a project without all of our tool sets and see if we can get to places in a new way that we maybe wouldn't get to if we were using all of the skills that we already had command over. And it's more of a way of entering into a way of questioning and being. I wouldn't say we go through our whole project like that. So an example is also another example of this kind of being in between things. This is a project called erratum, which means it's a name for an error in typography. And when type used to be set by physically metal type, often there would be an error. And that was, if there was an error in the type, it was called an erratum. And we felt like the American toilet is a very large error in terms of design. And we wanted to use it as a symbol of kind of entering into a new project and form of questioning. So we just kind of smashed this toilet one day. Oops, I'm going to go back. It's kind of on autopilot. Smashed this toilet as a way to transform this matter and start a questioning. And in this smashing, we thought, how could we take this kind of tool this tool of the toilet that's very dysfunctional and wasteful and maybe turn it into something that is useful. And I'm wary of that term useful, but in the process, we thought, oh, we could actually reform these as bricks, basic building blocks. And this project also makes me feel like it represents sometimes we're sort of stuck between wanting to work inside the museum and thinking about this ready-made and the reverse ready-made, and maybe we are thinking about also the reverse ready-made. So we often, Futurefarmers are invited by museums, but we often push out of the museum, but our work often comes back in the museum. And I'll show you some examples of that. So this project was more just a self-initiated exploration. And then it turned into a project later where the San Francisco Foundation for the Book asked us to do a book, and we asked if we could do a brick. So we made a series of bricks from these smashed toilets that were given inside of these wooden brick forms, and then a book of our inquiry was given. It's going on its own. So the last part about Future Farmers, we're based in San Francisco. This is San Francisco. And I think another tension about the Bay Area and San Francisco, where Future Farmers emerged from, is this, this situation of Silicon Valley and the high-tech industry that is really driving a lot of the reality around San Francisco. And the pictures you're seeing, Simon, I don't know why it's going on its own. Let's see. Okay, I'll just try to ignore it. It's forwarding on its own. The pictures I'm showing you were a project that, these are drawings of a project that was done in 1975 at Stanford University. And it was a group of 60 practitioners that came together to imagine a space station that was supposed to be launched in 1985. And this was called the Stanford Torus. And I'm showing you these because I saw these images and I thought it was interesting how, if we have the potential to actually transport ourselves into a new, completely new living space, how kind of limited our imagination was. This picture is really just looks like a suburb of California. And even this image is really just a kind of remapping of this area near Stanford where the meeting was happening into this imagined space. So I was asking myself, why do we limit ourselves if we can imagine? How can we imagine further? But I think the most interesting image is this image where they actually illustrated the tensions going on at that time in 1975 and prior to that in the Bay Area, which were basically Silicon Valley has the largest number of military contracts in the world. And if you look here, I'll do my mouse. This is a portrait of the Bay, the San Francisco Bay, and it separates two parts of the region. And up here, they've illustrated these kind of hippie houses. And this was a commune of 60 different communes called The Land. It was where the Whole Earth catalog came from. I'm just going to go back because it's going forward. Joan Baez had a commune up here, and a lot of the people here had been transported. They came from the East Coast to come west and start communes, and were a large part of the draft resistance. So they were, during the Vietnam War, resisting to go to war. And maybe I can pause this somehow. Yeah. Can I just stop for a second? Is there any way to stop this from going on its own?
Yeah, I think maybe go back to the smaller screen.
Yeah.
If you could, yeah, and then if you go down, yeah, there, and then do full screen.
Yeah, that's what I did.
But I think this should work. Let's try.
I'll try to talk faster. I think I'll move on from this. Yeah, I was just showing these images to say that where Future Farmers emerged from, the kind of still doing it. Yeah, there's this sort of, there's this tension between the counterculture and the corporate culture, and it's kind of a unique situation where they actually collaborate. So the counterculture, like Stuart Brand, who started the Whole Earth catalog, may have started as an activist or kind of having a counter presence, but then became highly involved in the high-tech industry and is quite a techno-futurist at this point. So again, Future Farmers came out of this place where these two worlds maybe counter each other, but they merge and intermingle. And I think that's something that we try to do in our work, is try to bring people together from different ideologies and points of view, and find a place where they can meet and maybe open up and change their positions. Okay, I'll go faster from now. So I'm just going to jump into some projects now. So coming from this International Space Station that never was realized, it was imagined, but it never was realized. We Future Farmers are often invited to places far, far away from San Francisco. So this is a picture of a project we did in Abruzzo, which is a rural part of Italy on the east side on the Adriatic. This is a project we did called This Is Not a Trojan Horse. So we were invited into this small region to imagine the future of farming. And it's quite odd to be an outsider and come into a place where you don't speak the language and imagine the future, someone else's future. But the thing we had in common is there's a strong interest in farming and future farmers, which we can talk about in a minute. So we came to this part of Italy on invitation of a residency called Pollinaria. And for the first weeks, we just roamed around to the different villages with a translator and asked people what their image of the future of farming was, what their memories were of this place. And everybody said, there is no future of farming. They can't imagine the future. It's over. It's too economically hard. The youth is moving to the cities. The older farmers are not, they're dying. They're not going to be here much longer. And climate change has made this region really a hard place to be in terms of the land is eroding. It's drier, it's colder. But the one thing that people kept saying is 10 years ago, there were wild horses here roaming around. But because Ryanair put an airport in, many people from England and Northern Europe have bought their second homes here, and they don't want these wild animals. So they've put up fences. And so there's no more wild horses. And somehow that stuck in our head as like a collective image. So we built a not Trojan horse from as much local materials as we could. And we proposed to wander around these villages. These are the names of the villages for 2 weeks and just see what happened. And I think what was great about this project is that we weren't working with a traditional institution that usually demands like to know who your audience is, when you're going to be there, how many people are you going to reach. We had the freedom to just kind of go and see what happened. So we would go into villages. Our idea was to walk it to all these different places, but the village is very steep. So we borrowed a tractor and would go with a tractor and then walk into the villages. And immediately the sound of this horse was very loud. People would open their windows and children would come and surround the horse. On the left was one of the oldest members of this village who just sat and watched us for hours while we were there. This is another village where we had to install a stationary version because it was on a cliff, but we still wanted the feeling of people to be able to walk this horse. And what started to happen is people would come from one village and we would ask them to write their image of farming. What's your image of farming? We would ask them to write it on the inside of the horse's belly was a chalkboard. And when we would go to the next village, the village would read the words from the village before, and they would start to kind of converse back and forth. And we started to get a following from village to village. We had a fan named Tonino. He was a farmer who came to the first village, and then he told his friends, and he came to the second village. And one day he said, can you come to my farm? Because my brother can't leave the farm. He has to milk the cows, and my wife can't leave the farm. And they would love to see the horse. So we started to go to farms as well as villages. And this was just a beautiful moment where what happened often is people would see this horse and they would say immediately, "Che cosa? La cavala? Why the horse?" And immediately questions were asked and conversations would emerge. So I think what I just want to say about this is that in our work, the form and the objects that we make, we've started to call relational objects. They're objects that somehow immediately create and form relations by the kind of wonder of them or the absurdity of them. This was on one of the last days where we went to a village fair. And by this point, we talked to mayors in different villages and many different people. And there was an interest to keep this conversation going by farmers who we had met and mayors and people who hadn't met in a long time. And they kept saying, the horse has given us a reason to talk, like it's given us a reason to imagine the future of farming. So from this project, I'll kind of wind back into it through the lecture. We continued this project and it's still going, into a radio station where people could talk to each other, and we would continue interviewing people. So I'm going to flow into another project called Flatbread Society. This is a very long project. It was an 8-year-long project in Oslo, Norway. And it was kind of triggered by a project we had done in San Francisco in 2007 called Victory Gardens, which I won't talk about, but it was an urban gardening project that we did with the city of San Francisco. So the city of Oslo invited us to be part of their public art program for this waterfront development. So this is the waterfront of Oslo in development. And the idea was they were creating a new fjord city, and they wanted 3 public art projects to be in one of the common areas in this waterfront. I often go back and look at what a place was 100 years before, or as far back as we can, but we found this image of this port area 100 years before, and it was actually right here. There was the King's Garden, and this was a boat building port, which it was up until the 80s. It was a production, a productive space where boats were built. But in this image that we found of the King's Garden, often historical precedent is quite useful with cities. And so, you know, if you show the city this image and say, we want to make a farm here, they really can't imagine a farm there. But if you say, hey, 100 years ago, there was actually a farm and it was the king's and it fed all of the people working in the port, somehow they can imagine the possibility of that happening now. So this was the port. It was, no one lived here per se. It was more of a productive industrial place, and then it was derelict for 20 years, and then they decided to redevelop. The only thing that's kind of left from the era that wanders around in this area are these suite of rescue boats that were built in the 1890s. They still work, and they're basically built to rescue boats in distress during storms. So this was an image we kept seeing in the harbor. So we were invited into this strange landscape. It was meant to be a construction zone for 20 years. And we were kind of like, what do you do in this space? And we're coming from San Francisco and Belgium. And I should say that a core group of Futurefarmers is from Ghent and Antwerp. And we were shown pictures like this, which they'd already kind of figured out everything that was going to happen in this area, which is quite typical of these projects. They have to sell this image and this sort of thing. And we would, oops, no, that one's not strange. We would get pictures of even how to use this space, but often there's no people in the spaces. And so we were a bit about doing this project. It's a massive waterfront development with all the contradictions we can talk about as well. But we went to visit the site, and this is what it looked like. It was a construction zone. And we said, if we were to work, instead of like kind of looking down at these models and imagining what's going to happen, can we start now one of the common zones and just place ourselves on the ground instead of these gods and start to see what happens? And wow, not showing. Strange. And so we proposed to the city to let people start farming there in plots. And the city thought we were crazy. They said, no one wants to farm in Oslo. People have just moved here from the countryside to be urban, and the last thing they want to do is farm. And we said, can we just offer plots? Wow, what's going on? Can we offer plots and see what happens? And so we asked if it would publish a call for farmers or for people to farm and in different languages at the libraries and newspapers, and 4,000 people signed up to have plots in this place. And the city was kind of shocked, like, wow, we didn't know people would want to farm here. So the city gave us soil and plots for 150 people our commissioner had a public hearing, all the 4,000 people, not all the 4,000 people, but many people, to try to create a group that would commit in here for 2 years. That was a very diverse group of people. And 50 people took on this presence and self-organized and called themselves Glory. And we kind of knew if we started here, just being present, that things would start to happen. So this was a picture I wanted to show. Somehow I'm not showing, but 150 organized, and we're in this section of this area that we worked in for 2 years. And from this moment, we had the security of being present here as a allotment garden, and we wanted to build on this idea of this common area in the waterfront, what it really could mean for the project for a long term. So this is a permanent public art project we decided to do. And in Norway, the commons are referred to as allemannsretten. It means the right to roam, and it's a constitutional right that in Norway you can go walk across your country in the night on private property if you don't, if you're not annoying, and really in the country. And it's quite a special thing. And they wanted to really hold on to that in the city as well. Common areas were supposed to be without commerce and for everyone to be a part of. And then another thing we wanted to do is, since we were growing there, we wanted to try to grow only non-certified seeds that were held in the commons. So in Norway, there's a name, or probably here in Belgium too, Urkorn is a corn that hasn't been industrialized. It's often, it's not in the market. So we wanted to focus on using Urkorn in this area as a symbol of the commons. So in this wish to do that, we found a farmer named Johan Sward who was growing grains and trying to get them back in production. So one of the grains he was growing was this called Finnish rye, and it's very tall. And he and a historian actually found this grain in an old sauna that was used by the Forest Finns. The Forest Finns, a nomadic people that lived in Norway until the late 1800s. And they were known to grow the special rye, but no one had seen it. And they said, well, we know they dried the rye in their sauna. So Johan got permission to take apart this roof of the sauna, and they found 9 grains in the roof. And they planted those 9 grains, and from those 9 grains, 7 grew and started to get these grains back into production. And what Johan does is he gets grains from gene banks, these ancient or farmers' grains, and grow them in real life so that they can adapt to the changing environment. And then he sends them to the gene banks. And many farmers are doing this. And so we thought it would be great if we could put this rye as a starting grain on the site. When we met with Johan, he said, we don't need museums to conserve varieties. What we want is to grow them. And we thought it was a beautiful metaphor in terms of our art practice as well. I mean, of course, we do need museums, but often we push out of the museum into kind of the mess of the world and the life of the world, and adapt to that situation rather than in the white protected box of the museum. And what he was saying here is we don't need gene banks to conserve varieties. What we do need to do is to grow them and preserve. The best way to preserve a variety is so it can change and adapt. So we spent several years, actually. Johan, he became a partner in this project to propose a permanent project here, his kitchen table. And we'll come back to that. He hosted meetings with soil scientists, with other farmers to think about, can we make a grain farm in Norway? We started to take this project seriously. So we formed, I would say, a council of guardians, and it was quite informal, but we wanted to always have people that we could check in on for this project, even to check in on ourselves, like, hey, we're still working in this waterfront development, yeah, we just wanted people to check in with. So some of the people were Amy Balkin, an artist in San Francisco. All the people we chose to work with were either artists or practitioners dealing with the commons, intellectuality, or gentrification. So it was Henrik Lubin from Berlin, from Humboldt University, Koba Mattis, maybe you know him, Amy Balkin, and Neil Smith, photographer and colleague of David Harvey. So often I go in with them and kind of see, should we do this project? And are there any projects that have precedent with this that we can back on? And it was very important, this group of people. And then we got permission to install ourselves temporarily, and we proposed to have this land developed as a grain field and a working farm, and that it possibly needed a shelter. And we proposed to build a bakehouse. In Norway, a bakehouse is quite a traditional building in rural areas. So cities had them, or many small towns had a common bakehouse where people could bring their grains and bake and store their bread for the season. So we proposed to do this temporarily, and somehow people were really excited about this bakehouse in the city. And everything we did to do transparently. So we wanted to build a bakehouse with ovens, bake ovens, and we invited people to come and learn how to make ovens while we built them. And we worked with a bake oven builder, so we had some skills, but he also trying out things that he had never done before. And what we wanted to do was, in Norway, there's different communities in the areas in the neighborhood near where we were working. And one thing that was sort of in common between the Norwegian nationals and the immigrant population was that everyone was eating flatbread. So we thought it would be interesting to make this kind of mothership form in the bakehouse that could accommodate all different types of bread making, which it did. And there was a tandoor and a traditional raised bread oven, and then here is a traditional take oven for flatbread. And when we built this, it kind of just started attracting different people. And on the right, you're seeing an after-school group of immigrant teens who came and built flatbread. And I'll show you more people who came later. At the same time that we had this temporary place at the waterfront, we also made this metal oven that would wander around the city and kind of broadcast our idea of bakehouse, and also interview people. And again, this is a foundational object that wandered around from the site. So we would row around, go to different neighborhoods and bake. And we also had this telescope rolling pin. There was this another relational prop that kind of had this dual function of looking, so we could see that as a telescope and then also as a rolling pin. We also had a streaming radio station. This is Marta van Dessel, some of you might know from Antwerp, with her microphone embedded in a baguette, another relational object. So we would interview people about this area, this changing area, and their fans of it or their critiques of it, and then it would be streamed online so people could hear it. And it was also an archive of our research. So the project was, this first part was this temporary bakehouse at the water, wandering canoe oven that sort of acted as a mode of broadcast, the radio station. And then we also would always, when we did projects, create a suite of posters to plaster around the city to invite people to the programs. So the first did quite a lot of programming in the site and then around the city with the canoe oven. What that did is it started to trigger interest, and people started to program the place themselves. So there was like a climate change conference, and they asked if they could come and have their conference session at the bakehouse. On the right, there was an anti-GMO protest that year, and they were doing a demonstration, and they could host their a soup gathering after the demonstration at the site. Left down here is actually an action where we seeded with that group ancient grains, and on the right bottom is a group that was trying to protect the harbor as a public harbor within this waterfront development. So the site kind of became this place where people would meet and they would propose their own of using it. And at the same time, this piece of land that we had allotment gardens on was taking on a life of its own too. So beekeepers were coming, they were establishing, these were a group of artists who wanted to become beekeepers, and they just showed up on this site and started beekeeping. They evolved themselves into a group called Oslo Apiary, which is still there and active. And people saw that we were farming, and this farmer who drove by one day and he said, "Oh, you're farming here. You're going to need to plow this field. Bring my horses." And so things just started to happen on this field, and it really excited the imagination city and gave us license to be there in a more permanent way. So after the temporary bakehouse, we started to look at this piece of land behind that we were farming on, and proposed for it to be a permanent grain field, hosting these ancient grains. And so we started to find more of these examples of these grains and showcased them here. And then we needed soil to the site because it was really just a barren landscape of rock. And instead of bringing soil from somewhere else, the university had offered to build for us and bring it in mass. And well, that's great. We thought maybe it's interesting to invite farmers from all over the region and bring a symbolic amount of their farm to lay on the ground as a stage that represents not only urban farming, but peri-urban farming that's feeding the city. So we had this soil procession where 52 farmers came with their soil in wagons and tractors, and we brought the soil onto the field, and we asked everyone to put one sample of the soil into this mix that mixed into a new culture, and named it that day, which name was decided to be Losetter, which means a common in the city. And we co-wrote a declaration that day with the farmers and the cultural minister and of agriculture and many of the people who were working on this land to declare that this site and this new development would be a new cultural institution called Losetter, dedicated to art and culture. And we asked the soil to be our witness, this new mix of these 52 different soils from around Oslo. So this was a very important moment for the project where the city saw that there was interest, serious interest. I was quite interested in the idea of this new cultural center without walls within this new development that was hosting also the National Museum, the National Library, the National Opera. So we got permission to be there permanently, and we proposed to make a permanent bakehouse. And we wanted to somehow pay homage to this history of building that was there in this port before. So we proposed to make a bakehouse that was in the form of a boat, especially this Colin Archer boat that we had seen in the port. So we worked with a group of boat builders nearby and made this, basically a copy of this boat. And this is the form of the bakehouse that was built in 2016. And the idea was on one side would be a propagation house, and on the other side is the bakehouse. So this would be where you could serve plants in the winter or the spring, and the studio house, and then there's a rooftop area. At the same time, we thought it would be very important to transfer some of this art money. So we had quite a nice budget to work on. But I always feel it's important to have that money go back into the local economy. And I really wanted to have some of this funding go to farmer, to hire a full-time farmer and demonstrate that this farmer and actor within the city limits would actually be a very important figure. So we partnered with the Norwegians Union and were able to hire. Our first year, we had Andreas on the right, and then now we have two more farmers, Øystein and and this is a really important aspect of the project because they're like a stronghold. They're always there. They're versed farmers. They're also quite social. So it's an important part of the project. So the bakehouse was also important as a way for the city to kind of take us seriously as an artwork. You're being questioned, like, where's the art? What's this mess? But somehow this figure, this charismatic of the bakehouse, gave us license to actually stay there in perpetuity for now. And it started to take on a life of its own as well. So there's a bakers union that bakes there every week. People can book the bakehouse online. It's kind of like a common cabin. You have to be trained to use the ovens, and then you can be a key holder. And this is what it looks like, I think, last year. So it's still developing. It's very organic. There's many different groups working there. There's many different subs, and we tried to really keep it as open as possible so that it could change as with people's desire and with people who come and go. And it's a strange one. People always ask what these two towers are. So in the middle of this landscape are these exhaust pipes from a tunnel that goes under the ground where cars go. There was also a discussion about fallout from this exhaust, and we can talk about, we've been working with soil scientists to test the soil throughout the whole project. So this is now. And a question is, when you work on a press long, how do you leave the project? So we knew we had 10 years. And at one point thought, oh, it'd be great to leave by sailboat and take the grains we've been growing on a reverse back to where they were domesticated, because these seeds that we were growing had never gotten industrialized. So they were all grains that kind of stopped being grown in the 1800s and then were only rediscovered around in the 70s. So they still had this very robust, resilient qualities that weren't industrialized out of them. We said this kind of in passing to our commissioner, like, oh, it'd be so great to sail these back to, Fertile Crescent, and she took us seriously. And we were able to work with some captains who owned one of these Colin Archer sail boats, and we went from Oslo all the way to Istanbul over 2 years, taking these seeds on a journey back to where they had been domesticated. This was our sailing ship, so we actually did get to work on one of these boats, the Christiani. And we organized a crew of sailors and then artists and anthropologists, farmers who are all interested in these seeds, but also expanding our journey to the commons in terms of international waters, the electromagnetic spectrum, land use, and even education. So boat was like a traveling school, a traveling museum. People would come to the boat, we would exchange seeds, people would give lectures, institutions hosts along the way. This is a farmer from England who joined us at the mouth of the Thames, and he rode up the Thames with us, and he needed some grains delivered, but he also gave us kind of a history how grain moved through the Thames in England. These seeds also made their way into museums. So while they were gathered on the journey, we were often hosted by museums on this journey, and then we would exhibit them in these very short-term exhibitions. So with each of the seeds, we gathered these stories of their friends, the kind of legacy of their stories from the farm memory, and we collected each of these encounters we collected the seeds in very small vials, and then we also collected the actual grains that we would then trade with other farmers along the way. And then we exhibited these collections in this small version, this scale model of our boat, which we called our rescue boat. We would always think if our boat goes, the seeds will go on. And so we found ourselves in different places because we were hosted by institutions. So on the left was an exchange in the National Library in Wales, where we brought grains from England to farm Wales. On the right, this is a seed ceremony we held in Belgian Poyota land, where this ancient grain had been found in an archaeological excavation. And on this day, we named, it was a grain that was grown during the time of Bruegel. we called this ceremony Bruegel Awakens, and a group of farmers who were interested in these grains came together and did a seed exchange. And then we accepted this grain that they found to the seed journey and went from Poyota land with the canoe oven to Antwerp, where our boat was, and took those seeds further on. So we also ran a pirate radio station. This is Marta van Dessel, our crew member and Futurefarmer collaborator for a long time. So every time we came aboard, we would put an antenna up onto the mast and broadcast reviews we had with farmers on a very local pirate radio station. And I think it's important to say that when we started to work on the seed journey, we started to think about the electromagnetic spectrum as a critical natural resource that's also in need of preserving and protecting from the encroachment of the closure of that. And we also started to think of these overlapping metaphors between agriculture, farming. If you think about broadcasting seeds, you're also broadcasting radio, you're propagating the airwaves, and we're propagating seeds. And so that became an interesting overlap between Marta's research in electromagnetic commons and our research in the intellectuality around seeds. So I'm going to kind of walk out of Seed Journey. And at the same time this Oslo project was happening, we would get adaptations or other projects were still going, and they started to kind of collide and overlap. So back in Abruzzo, where we did the Trojan horse, and a group of farmers got together and they started a consortium. They were all ancient grain growers, and we started a radio station with them called Consortium Instabile. And we used to make a meeting place for them in the form of a tree house on this farm, where we could continue to have conversations that formed during the Trojan horse. So this is sort of a side trip, but it's connected to, it's all interconnected. So this is a tree house built from fallen oak trees from a storm this year. And then we did a tour to visit all of these farmers in the consortium and its radio station called Radio Instabile. And we worked with a group of radio stars, Tiziano and Ilaria, they run radio stations and media theory around radio. And I think the interesting about this tour was that farmers kept saying, our seeds are our media, seeds are social media. And we started to form a kind of mythology on the meeting of this consortium and created a kind of speculative, fictional, factual radio program. And so every time we meet one of these farmers and interview them, we brought this seed box and asked them to contribute seeds. And we dedicated the seed box to this consortium of the farmers. So this kind of constellation of where they're located in the region and a little horse. We ran a radio station and we would these interviews, but then we also asked the farmers to read a random page from Italo Calvi's Baron in the Trees, because our radio station was up in this tree. And we would stream these readings in the middle of the night. So like at 3 a.m., maybe a farmer is milking a cow, or maybe they're dreaming. This information would be in the electromagnetic sphere. And then we inaugurated this treehouse with a procession with many of the farmers met before on the Trojan Horse Project. And we often create sort of props and masks, and these were used because some of the farmers said, what I'm doing is actually illegal by growing grains that aren't certified, and they wanted to remain anonymous. So we made these masks for them. And then we moved out of the treehouse and took these interviews to Rome, to the Maxi Museum, where we held there was a 3-day conference. and streaming of these conversations from there's in the mountains growing old grains, and then conversations in the city broadcast on the National Radio 1. So I think it's important to think about how our work kind of moves from these very remote places, and then the museum sort of act as this transmitter, amplifier of these voices that maybe wouldn't be heard from these remote locations. And then we moved with Seed Journey back onto the boat. And then this is another stop we did in Spain, in Santander, invitation of the Botan Foundation. And so every time we would land in a place, try to align with grain farmers and anyone who was interested in the idea of bringing back these ancient grains into production. So this was a procession we did in the museum back to the boat, and then launching Seed Journey into a land-based journey through the Picos de Europa in Spain. This is a kind of a group of people who came off the Seed Journey and went for a 7-day, taking these seeds up into the mountains to trade with shepherds who are growing grains in the high altitude. This is a Professor Ignacio Chapella who joined us from Berkeley. And then the project would get transmitted into exhibitions. So this was seed mast we built for the Sharjah Biennale. And we called this project Receiving Me, because often we would be on the journey sailing, but we would be invited to exhibitions. So we tried to install ourselves in these exhibitions while we were en route on the Seed Journey. So this mast was actually receiving images, SSTV, which is just a way of transmitting images into radio and then back into images again. So we would send images to the seed mast from the journey. And on the wall is a series of postcards we wrote from the journey to an anthropologist, Michael Tossig. So it was a conversation we had from the ship with him on land and back. And we thought of these as, again, kind of a way to pollinate the story. This is just a picture of the mast at the section going through the museum, again, trying to push out of the museum. And these are some of the images that were sent. I think we can hear it, maybe. So these images are sent basically line by line. So it's translated from an image into sound and then back into an image again, kind of like a fax machine. This is an image from the top of our mast down onto the boat. I think I'm going to go a little faster. These are some of the postcards that were sent. Read one. So I would do a drawing and I would send a postcard, and then Michael Tossig, an anthropologist in New York, would respond with remarks. So the domestication of plants involved a long march through trial and error, not to mention whereby certain varieties became reliable foodstuff. It was a revolution in wilderness, ushering in what is called the Neolithic period with tremendous consequences, which of course was deforestation. We sail along the cusp of many contradictions. So then, just kind of short version of the Seed Journey, we came back to Oslo in our final year, rather than purely sailing away. We came back and ran a last program, and we would come back over the 8 years. Futurefarmers would come back every year, and we kind of thought of it as a season. We would come back for several months and activate the space through public programming, working with local artists, and trying to kind of create a surge of strangeness in this landscape. And so this was our last program we did. We did the soil procession. We did a session called Bread Needs Hands, and this was called Décollage. And the idea here was really for us to depart. How do we really depart from this place? And we did it through creating this sonification of the bakehouse. So one last transformation of this bakehouse from purely a baking and a cooking and a meeting place into a jam session, where the ovens became instruments. We invited people from the United States and Belgium to come and perform with local sound artists, and Marta Venda curated this session. We sonified grains and animated them. The tandoor oven became a listening booth. And after this sonic session, we, Futurefarmers, with many of the people who'd worked with us over 8 years, went on a walk from the bakehouse back to Johan Swaard's farm, which was a 5 days walk, and brought all the seeds that we had gotten on the seed journey and had grown in the last years on the land to his farm. It was a very slow and steady departure back onto land. So this public program was called Through the Tandoor and Further On to Land. We walked for 5 days and stayed in common cabins along the way. Sometimes we didn't know where we were going to stay. It was an intense walk. We carried these masks, but we decided not to wear them. We would be transparent. And we would stop at different farms along the way as well that we had encountered or who had counseled us over the time of the project and brought them seeds back from a seed journey or from the farm in the city. And we, on our last day, we were at the farm at the land of Johan Swaard, and came in this small little boat to pick us up. He said, "Come to the waterfront and we'll go the last leg on a boat." So we all had different varieties on our back that we had walked with for these days, and all of the samples and collection from the seed journey, and also bread we had baked for this journey. And he and another farmer came, and we went along the fields to his house, back into his house, shared all the seeds we had collected from other farmers and the stories we had collected. And then we ended up back at this table again as at sort of the ending point of this project. And this whole group that is with us kind of has carried on the project in different ways. And that's why we called this last project program Further On. So I think I'm going to stop there and open up for questions. And then if the questions lead in, I have a few more videos, just some short clips to show.
Yeah, so if people have questions, you can ask them. We have 2 questions by Ronnie. The first one was very in the beginning, when you showed the toilets. So he's asking, why do you see a toilet as dysfunctional? We use it several times a day. Okay.
Practical question. So I would say it's in the United States that it's coming from that the toilet is using 12 gallons of fresh water every time you flush the toilet. And it's absurd that we use fresh water to get rid of our excrement. And that it's an institution in our life that you are forced into this contradiction every day. I mean, you can choose to have a different toilet. We also, I mean, that's one part of the kind of dysfunctional aspect of it. We also were interested in the image of the toilet in the art frame of the ready-made, and thinking about how our work operates ready-made and reverse ready-made and reverse ready-made.
Maybe it's an idea to stop sharing your screen as well.
Yeah.
Let me see your head.
My head. Thank you.
Well, another question by Ronnie is about the Flatbread project. The question is more or less, when you say where's the art in the project, is it okay to say that the art is in the performance, the props, mask, rolling pins, and the carriers of the message? Or is there still another artistic aspect?
I think it's fine to say that. And I think for us, it's interesting that the work makes you ask that question. Work is making you ask, where's the art? Then I think maybe we're doing something that's putting us to think about what art can be. Like, okay, then you must have a presupposition about what is if you're asking what the art is. And it opens up different ways of thinking about what art is and what we're doing. So I think I'm kind of happy when that question, I think in our earlier years, it used to frustrate me, but I think it's a great to be in. Again, when in the beginning of of the presentation, like I think we enjoy kind of being in this tense space between, is it art, is it not art, is it wild, is it domestic, is it industrial, is it Urkorn space?
Yeah, maybe to elaborate a little bit on that, within the whole, let's say, the whole eco movement, I think since, let's say, the 50s or 60s, it has transformed all the time. And I'm quite wondering where you see the role of art in this movement.
It's a really good question. It's a question that I think I struggle with a lot, and I have to say I'm representing 4 or 5 other practitioners that the work I showed is many voices. I'll just speak from my personal perspective. I think I wouldn't say that art alone is doing much for the ecological distress that the world is in right now. I would say that maybe a combination, direct action, participatory democracy, religion. I think it's like, I think art plays a part in it. I think it works on a level of on opening up spaces, ability of thinking about ways thinking about things in a different way. But I think it is a very small part. I think when it works in combination with the other things I mentioned, direct democracy, activists, grassroots organizations, I think it can operate as a fire of that work. Mm-hmm. Because we often artists hand of media, we work with institutions that have media connections, and with Flatbread Society, the media was a big collaborator with us. Like when our work in the newspaper, the city took us seriously, and then they adopted ideas for us for their green green agenda for cities in Oslo. So maybe it started as an artistic gesture, but it was an ecology of practices that I think made the change.
Because it's like, what really fascinates me, of course, there are a lot of people working with ecology and also, let's say, doing different projects, but also being aware of soil, of seeds, and try to give awareness to this. And I think it's very interesting that within your practice or the Future Farmer practice, you can say, I really see it as an artistic project, and where you use soil and seeds and ecology, maybe even as a medium. So in a way, I feel that you are, let's say, making an artwork with ecology as a medium, much more maybe than that you try to create something purely focusing on the seeds, for example, and then see how can we make an artwork out of this, or is this art? Like, it's really your medium as a painter is using paint and canvas, and of course then it's a canvas. Like, but I'm just wondering in which way this, how this works, or when does it become an artwork? Like, what are the to really explain it, but what are the borders, or do you open it up, or like what are the rules, so to say?
That's an ongoing question. But as you were talking, I was thinking You said we use soil or we use seeds, and I think I feel like maybe they but I think it's I think that it evolves away. I think how we start a project is trying to be super open and just being in a place. And I think often being an outsider actually is a gift. I used to think I was a bit nervous about it, but I think you start, because you're an outsider, you see things and you start to make the familiar unfamiliar to people, which opens up a space of openness. And I think what we try to do is not about what we're going to do. We're going to use soil and we're going to use seeds but just be in the situation and see what's there and just kind of, I think, make manifest already there. Like there in Oslo, it's almost like all the pieces were there. It's just that maybe people, you're in your daily rhythm, you don't see what's like around you, and it takes someone from the outside to kind of go, hey guys, you have this commons law that's so amazing, and you know there's these farmers all the city who are doing this amazing work. And I think working with museums does force us in a way to distill the work, because when you're working in this open organic way, it's quite messy and it's very in the moment. You have to react to people that come into the, you put the canoe on and you don't know who's going to show up. You don't know what the conversation is going to be. It's very emotional, and the museum gives you a space to kind of just, reflect and distill. And I think the distillations, like we had this telescope rolling pin, I didn't show it, but we have this timepiece that holds the grains in it. They become kind of these amulets, magical objects that give the project a different aura. Yeah, but it's ongoing conversation and evolution in the work.
Because if you say this, and maybe you can also say something, for example, the boat project. Like, of course, being in this boat together, I think you can say this is the artwork sitting there. But how do you translate this artwork? Because there you're sitting with maybe 10 people. Huh? So how do you translate this artwork to a bigger crowd or a museum or an institution?
So it's also a very good question. It's how it's gotten to bigger audiences through these collaborations with the museum. So I think we've exhibited Seed Journey maybe 10 now. And for example, in Wales, when we were exhibiting at Art Display, because you're working with the National Museum, they have contacts with the national radio station. And so when we did the exchange between the English grains coming back to Wales in the National Library, the BBC was there, and it was broadcast on the radio, and the farmers were really in tears because they were receiving this grain that hadn't grown in Wales for almost 100 years. And it was, this grain was actually sent to England years prior. They were growing it in Wales, and they sent it to England in case the crop would fail in Wales, they would have the England. But they didn't, the crop never failed, but they knew, oh, this grain still is in England and this farmer's growing it, brought it back. And it was this moment of reception, literally, materially, and then broadcast on the radio. And it's, the farmers are doing this very practice of trying to get these grains back in production, and they take it very seriously, but no one hears what they're doing. And by having that stage and that animation of their work on the radio, I think it reaches quite an audience. And I think in that moment, the thing reached the listeners was, one of the farmers said that the weight of the work they're doing really lays in the fact that if we are to transition from an industrial agricultural model to a smaller scale model, we need to build our seed stock. Our seed stock of these ancient grains is in gene banks, or it's very small. And so farmers are getting the grains out of gene banks and building up new populations of the grains to be durable in this time and place. And so that reached a national audience in England. It really, people kind of took it seriously for a moment.
Yeah.
Hopefully a long moment. But
then this is also, let's say, your strategy.
I don't think we entered into thinking about that as our strategy, but it revealed itself to us along the way. And it became more and more evident how important the museum as an institution is a partner to us. I think we often get disillusioned by the institution of the museum, constraints of it, and question the amount of audience that you actually reach through the museum. You know, if you're trying to do some semblance of activism, it's always been a question, is the museum the right place? But I think in this instance, it was learning how to work with the resources of the museum maybe in a different way, like to think about their connection to the media as a platform.
Yeah,
that's crucial to the people we're working.
No, but because I'm quite thinking about, of course, it's of course something totally different about land art projects, that everyone knows them, but not a lot of people saw them. But we know them because the artist thought of strategies of showing these works that we all know, like photographing it, filming it, writing about it. So this is what I'm wondering. Like, I can imagine the moment the radio comes to you, of course, this is a very nice way of showing the work, but this is maybe not your intention from the beginning, your idea of how can I show this project, that we are sitting here with a lot of interesting people in a boat.
I mean, the idea was to transmit it via radio, but I think as the project went, realized, like I already mentioned, the museums have a capability of transmitting way beyond our by radio or our, let's say, future podcast or But I think in that case, we didn't have a strategy set out.
No, but it's interesting that so many people get the projects, and I was wondering in which way this is part also of the intentions. Well, we have an interesting question here. So it's, thank you for the inspiring lecture. Since a lot of projects you have been doing are including travel and intimate exchange among people, what are your strategies of dealing with the current pandemic and lack of direct contact between people's situation?
Such a good question. Right now we're writing fairy tale, our second fairy tale. Well, I would say wonder tale. Yeah, that's a good question. All of our projects have been stopped. We have a lot of nice projects that we were granted in the next 2 years, a couple of public art projects, and the way we work, it's going to work right now. But we are working on a project in South Tyrol about the kind of tensions of land use there in terms of the monoculture, the apple monoculture, and the effects of that culture on the environment. And where we chose to use the form of a wonder tale, a fairy tale, a folk tale, that we're writing about this place, and that can be eventually told as a traditional folktale orally and kind of change and evolve as it's told. But for now, it will be a written form. And we're working from kind of what we've been there. We went there last year, and we went there for a week this year, lockdown. But as a way of dealing with it, we're taking the very local research that we did and writing kind of these distant voices to reflect on the situation there, because the situation is a portrait of things happening in other places. So the magical object and the relational objects operate in the story rather than in real life. But that's the working right at this very moment.
Another question, and where I also would like to add a question too. How did your collective approach change over time? And then I would add to it, you started in '95. I can imagine then there were other concerns than there are now. So maybe also this change, the topics you're tackling.
Yeah, For sure. Yeah, Futurefarmers started out as a design studio, and we were mostly making online platforms for social exchange, so pre-Facebook. The idea that we could create these spaces online where people could have, people from all perspectives could meet on topics. And I think the studio at that point and myself was really, I think we were convinced that, wow, technology, we can change the world, technology, and slowly, actually quickly, we were a bit disillusioned by that, more kind of concerned about these tools we were using, and started to take a turn of criticality about the tools we're using, the innovation going on in the Bay Area. So a lot of our early work was really looking at the history of the computer industry. In specific Bay Area, there was a lot of people that kind of came to the Bay Area, to Stanford, to Berkeley, to work on this idea of the personal computer for liberation, and found themselves working for the military, making tools for war. And so we started to kind of back off the tape, and we moved from a design studio into an arts group, basically because we found the space of art, a more space for questioning around that. I think the thread that works through Futurefarmers is about tools and tool making and the disassembly of these tools that aid us, and looking at how can we disassemble these tools and then reassemble them in different configurations that give them maybe a potential for this idea of liberation or self-organization. Maybe that's a bit broad, but I think that is it's something that goes with our questioning. And I think these forms we create are tools for provoking questions, for creating new relationships. I wouldn't say they're high tech per se. That's part of your question, and you had another part of your question.
The collective approach. So
yeah. So it always changes, and it's an interesting question now because there's new people. We're working with new configurations of people. For a long time, it was like a solid group of people, but and it so shifts based on the context we're working in, the funding. But it's like in the beginning, it was a design studio, and we had clients and we had a steady income, and we took 30% of our income and put it into a collective bank account. And at the end of the year, we would decide to do with that work. And so we funded the residency, and then we would decide on personal projects to work on. And that was quite a great and stable configuration. And when we started to move away from design, the art economy is much more precarious. So we all have our own kind of practices, or we teach, or people architects, and Futurefarmers becomes this space where we kind of leave our everyday jobs and maybe a bit more fertile, because it's a place where we hope a safe space for taking risks, doing things we maybe don't do in our institutionalized professions. The collectivity it's always a question. I mean, there's no kind of, we don't have, let's say, protocols per se, although we're discussing different ways of working economically right now, based on how we're all doing financially. But it's a lot of dropping out of our everyday lives and being in a situation together where we can focus on the situation. So like in Oslo, we would rent an apartment and live together for a month and just work on the project. So like the living and the breathing of our everyday lives were part of the project. I think that's when we're at our best. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I think so. Yeah, sure. So the collective was something like you started it as the main practice, and then it became also, so the role as a group changed, but the group itself did also change.
Yeah, and I don't know that I would call it a collective. I would say it's a working group. I call it a working group more. People kind of tend to put that title collective on us, and I think we used to have it on our website, but I think we form different working groups, and there is a solid body. Myself and Michael Swain have been a steady kind of body of Futurefarmers, and then for several years it was Marta van Dessel, Steen Schiffelers, myself, and Lotte Vranken, a lot of Belgians. Because of the Oslo project, we worked on that together for 8 years, and we would do other projects. And because we were working on that project, we were kind of the main constellation. And then other projects come along, and we work with new people, or through the artisan residency program, people come in, and there's a synergy, and we work together with new people a lot through the residency.
We also got some questions from YouTube.
Okay.
I don't always understand them, and maybe you do, so let's see.
Okay.
Do you relate art to novelty?
Novelty, wow. Novelty. Can that person elaborate a little more?
Yeah, Simon, you put them in. So Simon, you can maybe ask if they can elaborate a bit more. Let's go to another question that's a bit more clear, on point, I think. How is the financial support for the projects developed, progressed? Which strategies have you used?
Financial. All granting organizations tell us we're horrible business people. Just in a nuts and bolts way, we write a lot of grants. In the US, we write a lot of grants to support our work. There's been independent family foundations. That's kind of a thing in the United States. We've been supported by a group called the Compton Foundation. It's a family that funds work that has to do with different themes every 2. It's like education, water. They're very specific themes. But again, how we survive as a group is we all have our personal projects. Lotte's an architect. Marta does her own process. Michael Swain's a full-time professor at a University of Washington. So I would never say Futurefarmers is like a solid financial foundation. It's more of a place where we gather and do different things. Yeah.
Laboratory in a way.
I'm afraid of them, but yeah, just a space we protect where you don't have the constraints of maybe even yeah, it's just a place where we try to allow for challenging ourselves as much as possible.
Then a final question maybe, although I think you already explained it a bit, but let's see. I was just wondering whether you take a political stance. For example, the stance surrounding the CETA Accord or Mercosur, which obviously has a huge impact on local small-scale farmers.
Again, I'll talk personally because I think we all would answer that question very differently. And I think I have a very strong political stance, especially around the seeds. And that time in Europe when there was this question of the certification was going on. Our project in Oslo was very involved in that, trying to protect the rights of the seeds being held in the hands of the many rather than corporations. And I think that's something that even in the project in Abruzzo is something I stand for very strongly and want to protect. Again, I question the role of art in that. And I would just reiterate the combination of all the efforts that's important.
Right, but I think also that your work, or the work of Futurefarmers, it's impossible to see it as not political. Like even the gesture of going to the harbor of Oslo and make a farm there. I think this is something political, of course. It's poetic, but it's also political, how I see it. Because it also depends a bit how you define the political, I think. Right, but we had half an hour of questions, so it's quite, it's definitely food for discussion, I would say. What do you think? Shall we leave it here?
Can we leave it here unless there's a pressing question? I'm gonna keep thinking about novelty.
Yeah. We can think a bit about it, but I think also, I think it was a very nice talk. So thank you very much. It's indeed strange. I see just numbers. I see names coming in and leaving. So it's strange that we see each other a little bit and then people spying on us more. But thank you very much, Amy.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and I will see you soon, and hopefully.
Yeah, for sure. We see each other.
Okay.